Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 39 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks between the Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have won 5-2. So the Sharks continue their dominance over the Los Angeles Kings this season with this victory, but similar to some of their other victories versus the Kings this year, this was not necessarily the Sharks' cleanest game. It starts off quite poorly, I guess you could say, in the first period. The first couple of minutes, the Kings would actually get the first goal of this game from Alex Iafallo off of just poor defensive coverage in front of the net by the San Jose Sharks, kind of similar to the goals they were giving up in the previous game against the Anaheim Ducks, and so it was a 1-0 lead for the Kings. But the Sharks fought back very hard in this first period and got not one, not two, but three goals in that opening frame to make it 3-1, those coming from Kevin Labanc, Patrick Marleau, and Rudolfs Balcers. And that would be the score at the end of 20 minutes. In the second period, neither team would score, but the Kings would have the majority of the chances. Luckily for the Sharks, Martin Jones was there, as he has been against the Kings basically every game he's played against them this season. And so it was still 3-1 moving into the third period. However, there was a worry that the Kings could make a comeback. Not only have the Sharks given up a lead like this already at some point this season, remember the game against the Golden Knights, the Sharks were leading 3-1 and going into the third and actually ended up losing that game, but the Kings were actually trailing 3-1 to the Arizona Coyotes just a few days ago and would also end up coming back to win that game in regulation. So this was quite nerve-wracking, and even more so when the Kings would score to make it 3-2 from Anderson Dolan in just the first couple of minutes of this third period. However, the Sharks would play at least better defense than they did in the second period. Martin Jones would get back to his form of that second period, making some very nice saves, and the Sharks would eventually get an insurance goal shorthanded from Dylan Gambrell. Andrei Kopitar dives at the blue line to keep this puck in the zone, but he sends it to an area where only Brent Burns is, and Brent Burns clears this puck past Drew Doughty, who is blissfully unaware of what is going on behind him, which is Dylan Gambrell and Evander Kane in the neutral zone, ready to do a 2-on-0, and they execute it well enough to get it past Pearson, and as I said, 4-2, a dagger in the heart of the Kings. Eventually, the Sharks would add an empty netter with Tomas Hertl, and they'd get the victory 5-2. First thing to talk about would be usually the goaltending, but I've decided to make an executive decision and shift it to the first thing to talk about would be the Sharks' playoff chances, which I find to be very, very interesting this season. In many past years for the San Jose Sharks, they've either rarely been squarely outside of the playoff race like last season, or it's been pretty much assumed and almost guaranteed that the Sharks would make the playoffs coming down the final stretch of games. But this year is most interesting because the Sharks and Sharks fans all have their eyes glued to the scores of multiple other teams in the West Division, because the Sharks are just within a couple of points of a playoff spot, but it's nowhere near guaranteed that they'll be able to close that distance. So all 8 teams in the West Division were in action here tonight. One of the games was kind of inconsequential. The Avalanche, the top team in the division, against the Anaheim Ducks, the bottom team in the division. The Avalanche, unsurprisingly, would get that victory 2-0, but the 3 important games were the one here tonight for the Sharks, the Arizona Coyotes against the Golden Knights, and the Blues against the Wild. The Sharks, of course, took care of business in the end, forcing out this victory to move themselves up to 40 points. The Arizona Coyotes actually ended up losing to the Vegas Golden Knights by a score of 7-4 to keep themselves at 43 points, and now the Sharks, since they only have 39 games played and the Coyotes have 41 and only a 3-point deficit, technically if the Sharks win out and win the rest of their games this season and the Coyotes were to do the same, even though this is technically impossible because the Sharks have games against the Coyotes, but just for the sake of example, the Sharks would actually pass the Coyotes in the standings because those 2 extra victories and those 2 missing games played is enough to put themselves 1 point ahead of the Coyotes. On the other hand, the St. Louis Blues would be huge victors against the Minnesota Wild tonight, winning 9-1, which actually puts them on a 2-game winning streak because of their previous victory against the Golden Knights, 3-1. So the Blues, who seemingly were in free fall, had built up originally enough of a safety net in terms of points to still remain competitive after that rough stretch of games, and they find themselves still 2 points ahead of the San Jose Sharks with just 1 more game played, which of course is an issue for the Sharks, considering the Sharks have the tiebreaker against essentially nobody in this division because of all the shootout victories that they do have. So technically, with the Sharks not having any games against the St. Louis Blues left this season, they're in a situation where their fate is not necessarily in their own hands. If the Sharks were to win out this year and the Blues were to do the same, the Blues would actually get the tiebreaker and be ahead of the Sharks. Moving on to Martin Jones, on to what actually happened in this game. Jones was spectacular here tonight, kind of reminding me of his previous game this season against the Los Angeles Kings just a few days ago, where Martin Jones let in one goal, which was a very difficult save. This was the Iafallo one, of course, and then one goal which he absolutely would like to have back, like in the previous game against the Kings with Trevor Moore. The case was here tonight with Anderson Dolan. Just Martin Jones kind of had his head in the clouds a bit on this shot from the goal line, and it deflects in off of his skate and goes in. But otherwise, Martin Jones was very, very good in this one. The Sharks probably do not win this game if Martin Jones is not at the top of his game here tonight, and he absolutely gets another victory for the San Jose Sharks against the Los Angeles Kings, because as I mentioned earlier, the Sharks, while they've shown dominance sort of score-wise against the Kings this season, only losing one of their 7 games they've played against them, a lot of those games have been well played by the Kings, but it's been Martin Jones who's been really standing tall to prevent the Kings from actually getting any of those victories, or almost any of those victories. This, of course, begs the question of what happens tomorrow. Now, normally I would just assume Devan Dubnyk ends up playing because it is the second half of a back-to-back, but considering what happened last week where Martin Jones ended up starting both of those games, it's technically a possibility Jones could end up doing the same here, especially with how important this game against the Los Angeles Kings is. The Sharks win tomorrow. They're 6 points up on the Los Angeles Kings with just 16 games remaining for both teams. That puts them in a pretty decent position to keep that lead over the Kings and not really have to worry about them too much for the rest of the year. However, if they lose tomorrow, this puts the Sharks just 2 points ahead of the Los Angeles Kings. And as I mentioned, the Sharks do not have the tiebreaker against anyone, meaning if the Kings get just one more win than the Sharks in those remaining 16 games, the Kings will actually pass them there too. So it is possible Jones does get the start, though, because the Sharks' schedule is a lot more cramped over these next few weeks compared to the past week, which was definitely a bit more a lot more break time put in. I would say it seems like a higher chance Dubnyk gets the start tomorrow. Next, I'll talk about Ryan Donato. Now, for the Sharks, there weren't too many players who really stood out in the second and third periods, as I thought those were 2 periods where the Sharks found themselves defending a lot and nobody looked all that fantastic offensively. But in the first period, Ryan Donato was one of the most effective players for the San Jose Sharks in that one. It's not even that he scored. It's technically not even that his line scored. The Sharks got goals from technically that first line, the fourth line with Patrick Marleau, and the second line with Balcers. The third line for the San Jose Sharks did not score in that first period, and yet Donato looked so effective. He was working extremely hard on the forecheck. He was creating multiple turnovers for himself, and not the type of turnovers and takeaways that are like, oh, the opposing player just happened to pass to him and so that's a turnover, but actually he's sort of hounding guys, he's tying his stick up with other players' sticks and taking pucks away. I would say that happened maybe 3 or 4 times in that first period, so very, very impressive from Ryan Donato. He even set up a very, very good chance he passed it to Tomas Hertl, who passed it to Timo Meier for a very good chance in that first period that he ended up shooting over the net, and it was a great work by Donato behind the net to actually get that one. So it's going to be interesting at the end of the season because Donato's contract is actually up at the end of this year, and he's going to be a restricted free agent. So the Sharks will have the first opportunity to try and re-sign him, and we'll see if, I would assume the Sharks will do so, and what the contract the Sharks decide to give him will be, as it has been a bit of an up and down season for Ryan Donato in general. And finally, I'm going to be talking about Rudolfs Balcers. As I said, he scored a goal here tonight, and Balcers is probably going to go down as one of, if not the best waiver wire pickup in a long time for the San Jose Sharks, if not in San Jose Sharks history. I don't exactly know who the Sharks were picking up off of waivers in 1993, but at the very least in modern history, I cannot recall any waiver wire pickup that has worked out as well as Balcers has. He gets his 6th goal here tonight, which may not seem like a lot, but it should be be remembered that Balcers did not play for good chunks of this season. He actually only has 25 games on the year, so 6 goals in 25 games would put him on pace for about 20 goals in a full 82-game season. To go with that, his 13 points would put him on pace for about 44 points in a full 82-game season, which is quite impressive, especially when you consider the fact that he hasn't also been on that second line for the entirety of the season. In the first few games he has played, he was finding himself on the third or fourth line. But Balcers, when he's been playing with Tomas Hertl and Timo Meier, has been an extremely effective forward. I like that on this Timo Meier breakaway for this third goal, that Balcers follows up on the play, a very smart play for him to do that, and it works out in his favor where he ends up technically getting the game winner in that situation. And just he's been an extremely effective player on this line, and what I've liked most is that both Hertl and Meier at times have been sort of mediocre this season, and I think that Balcers is kind of kicking those two players into a bit of a higher gear, as both of them, especially Timo Meier, I would say, have looked significantly better over the past few games than they did at times earlier this season when maybe Balcers wasn't on that line with them. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, as I said, against the Los Angeles Kings, their 8th and final game against the Kings this season. And again, as I'll probably be saying for the entirety of this season, except for maybe the games against like the Avalanche, this is a very, very pivotal game for the Sharks' playoff chances. Class dismissed.